Welcome to Hey Chaplain. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. Hey Chaplain is the officer wellness podcast which brings you expertise and wisdom from police officers around the world. Sometimes early on a Monday morning, I will check my podcast stats, and I'll see groups of downloads in certain cities. And I'll think, aha, there's a place where a cop listened to the show, liked it, and then told his fellow officers. And now I have everybody on the detective bureau or everybody on that patrol shift listening to the show. There are agencies out there where it feels like nearly everyone there listens to the show. I'm looking at you, Andover Police Department. But not everywhere can be in Andover. Some locations in my statistics only show 1 or 2 downloads. But I'll see that town or city pop up every single week, which means I've got a listener listening to every episode, but they're not telling anyone else about the podcast. Telling someone about the podcast is the only proven way that podcasts grow. So tell somebody today about Hey Chaplain. Show them on their phone how and where to get it. Help them download an episode if they're just not sure. Tell them in your own words why you feel you benefit from listening to the show. On today's episode, we're going to talk to retired DEA agent Todd Hixson. Todd has a tremendous wealth of experience as a DEA agent, and we're definitely going to hear some of those stories working both domestically and on foreign assignment. But I'm going to split this interview into 2 parts that are both really compelling. First, we have the pros and cons of going Fed and how Todd navigated the DEA both for himself and his family. But then next week, we're going to have the other bookend, which will be knowing when to retire and how to prepare to leave a law enforcement career. Todd has a ton of valuable wisdom in both regards. You are not going to want to miss either part. Here's Todd Hixson. Hello, Todd. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you.
I'm glad you're here today, actually, here in person, right across the desk from me. I'm glad you're able to drive in today.
Yep.
We were talking earlier about how you discovered law enforcement. You're not from a law enforcement family, right?
No, not at all. I didn't even know anyone in law enforcement.
Okay, so how did you discover that law enforcement was your calling?
Well, I think it's an interesting story. Maybe it won't be for everyone. I was in college at the time. I was going to Texas A&M University, and I'm originally from Dallas, and I was back home for a break. A good friend of mine suggested that we do a ride-along with a friend of his at the Dallas Police Department. I think there was a man who was an officer who went to their church that they knew, and he had invited my buddy to go on a ride-along, and he also said, hey, you can bring a friend along.
So and how old were you guys?
19 years old,
okay.
20 years old.
Okay.
And so my buddy Brent gave me a call, and I said, yeah, we can do that. I'm sort of out of money for the weekend, so why not? Not something I'd ever thought about in my life, had ever considered. So we went and did a ride along with Dallas PD, and within the first 30 minutes, I discovered that this is what I was supposed to do. I really mean that. At the end of the ride along, everything had sort of changed for me in terms of what I wanted to do and what direction I was going to go in and what I was focused on. And that was great. I think my parents were horrified. Frankly, I think that my mom had probably wished I had gone to law school, and I think they had big thoughts about what sort of big, career I would have that had nothing to do with law enforcement. It sort of set the hook in me because all the guys were professional, educated, dedicated.
I was going to ask you what in the ride along really got you. Was it, because I heard people say it was the car, it was the uniforms, it was whatever. Some go on a ride along and some big action happens, which is actually pretty rare. But what was it?
So I don't think it had anything to do with adrenaline or any of that. And again, I'm looking at it through the lens of that being a long time ago. But looking back, it was the very clear sense of purpose. And I was raised, so my father had been a Marine fighter pilot and was an airline pilot. And he had always sort of told me, find something to do that doesn't feel like work, that's your passion, and that's what you need to do. And so I was never sort of motivated by money or motivated by really anything else other than I wanted to do something cool, right? Which that's how I would have described it at that age. But cool, in retrospect, was really more about important purpose. So I wanted to do something important, and
something meaningful.
Yeah, and this really fit that for me. And it was sort of tangible, and I could understand it, and I could talk to guys, and I could say, okay, here's the next step, here's the next step, here's the next step. And so I did that. I actually signed up for an internship with Dallas Police Department.
Did it change your course of study at school? Or did you just finish what you were doing?
So I started out as an international relations major. In my mind, I thought I sort of wanted to go work State Department, CIA, something like that.
Okay.
And then this came up, and I switched to sociology now. And that was because they didn't have criminal justice there. I learned to write. I was a good writer. Liberal arts helps you with that.
Well, and nowadays, a lot of departments are actually looking for somebody with a computer science background or other technology, finance, all that stuff actually helps a person be a more well-rounded investigator.
Absolutely.
And so pick up again. You're going through college. You're finishing college. You did an internship at Dallas?
I did one at Dallas PD and one at Bryan, Texas Police Department. So throughout the internships, I had several of sort of the older, wiser command staff folks. In fact, I remember at Dallas PD, there was a captain. I can't remember his name now, but super nice guy. And he told me, he said, listen, if you want to come do this, be a police officer, that's great. He said, if I were you, he said, and I wish I would have done this, he said, you need to go federal. So he said, get some experience and go federal. He said, I think you'll like it better. Now, that's not the reason why I went federal, but that sort of planted a little bit of a seed in my head.
Okay. So from early on, you had the notion
when I was in college, yep.
Yeah.
I sort of had that in my head. So I'm in my last semester, and I apply to a number of departments up in the Dallas area where I'm from, and I get hired by a suburb department up there, about 135 sworn at the time.
Okay. Right. So like a big, small department?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And a very professional department, paid well. This is back in the early 90s. When you would go test for a police department, you'd show up to the convention center in that city, and there'd be, several hundreds of people taking the test, and they were hiring like 4 people or 8 people.
Yeah. Those were the days.
And so, it was a different world. So anyway, so I got hired and went to the academy and put me out in patrol and did my thing at the police department I was there for about 4.5 years. Near the end, within the last year or so, I got picked up on our SWAT team, our TAC team, and that was a part-time gig. So primarily what we would do is we would serve search warrants for narcotics. And that's when that's when I was really introduced to DEA at that point, because we did a couple search warrants for DEA during that time when they came to us and asked us, hey, we're doing this big takedown. Can you hit a couple of these houses for us in your city? And so I got to know the DEA agents there. So the department I worked for, very nice suburb community, great equipment, well paid. But this, the citizens demanded a lot. So there was an expectation of how the officers would behave and deal with the public, and the staff expected that, right? Very professional. So we go out and do the search warrant, and I've got all my gear on, and everything's squared away on me, and the DEA agents that were out there with us, wearing a pair of jeans and maybe just a t-shirt or a jacket or something that said DEA on it, very super casual, and had a gun in their waistband, and that was about it. So anyway, we do the house, and it's actually in a nicer neighborhood, big house. Hit the house, do everything, and the alarm's going off in the house. The alarm's continually going off in the house. So I'm over at the keypad. I'm trying to figure out how can I turn this alarm off, and I don't want to damage anything. And so the DEA agent walks up to me. He said, "Hey, officer," he said, "is that a knife? Essentially a knife on my belt?"
Okay.
And he said, "Hey, can I borrow that?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." So he grabs it out of my pocket, opens up the knife, and just starts slashing the wires to cut it. And he said, "Here you go. Thanks." And and I know that sounds weird, but in my mind, I was thinking, wow, the genius of that. I'm sitting here as a local police officer thinking, how can I go through the proper procedure to fix this problem without upsetting the homeowner.
Right.
And meanwhile, this guy's like, give me your knife. I'm fixing to solve the problem right now.
Right.
I appreciated that. I thought that was pretty neat. Anyway, so I ended up applying with DEA and a few other federal law enforcement agencies about that time, and I got picked up by DEA.
How long from the point where it's like, okay, I'm going to apply versus when you actually left? How long did that process take you?
That was at least probably 8 months.
Okay.
Which was actually, in retrospect, was pretty quick because I know guys that had been in the process for a long time. Yep. But there was a big hiring push. This was back in the mid-'90s.
Okay.
And there was a big hiring push for DEA in particular during that time. They were running a lot of classes through, so timing was on my side.
Yeah.
And so I got hired and went to the academy.
So let me ask you about the pros and cons. What were the best parts of going Fed?
For me, the best parts of going Fed, and again, it's different for everyone. For me, it was going to open up a whole new world to me. Because DEA in particular, we have more offices overseas than any other federal law enforcement agency, or at least we did at the time. So our overseas presence was huge. Drug trafficking is an international problem. It's not confined to the borders of the United States or the borders of Texas or Kansas or wherever. So it was opening me up to a whole new world. That appealed to me a lot. It appealed to me to work with other agencies, work with the intelligence community, work with state agencies, work with other federal agencies. So there's a whole lot there. It also appealed to me to work narcotics, frankly, to work my own case and build my case up. Although I didn't really know at the time when I was applying exactly what that would look like. But that appealed to me at the time. In the long run, the money is significantly better, federal versus local. I mean, unless you're working for, a West Coast police department that's paying through the roof. But the problem is you got to live there. Right. The money was good. Prestige. Yeah, I thought was a strong selling point.
You get to cut the wires in the security alarm,
right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're basically. I mean, you're really treated like an adult. Yeah, and there were times at the police department, and I was a young kid in retrospect, so I can understand why I was treated this way. But you don't necessarily feel like you're always treated like an adult. By management.
Yeah. A lot of policies that go to the lowest common denominator.
And I completely, now I understand that. At the time, I probably didn't understand it quite as much. So all those things appealed to me.
Well, let's talk about some of the negatives, maybe starting with training. Did you go to FLETC or?
Quantico.
Yeah,
so the DEA Academy's in Quantico. Okay. It's on the, we share some of the facilities with the FBI Academy on the Marine base at Quantico. I knew that
actually, but yes.
And so it was, and I think it's still the same today, but physically it was probably the toughest academy out there in terms of physical fitness. The requirements are very stringent, and that cut out a lot of guys.
How long did that take?
The academy was 17 weeks. Okay. So
17 weeks, and you don't live in Virginia.
No, yeah, you're living in the dorm there at the academy. So, to me, that wasn't. I think if I had a wife and kids at the time, or I had a wife, but if I had kids at the time, that might have been more difficult. For me, it wasn't. I didn't see it as a difficult challenge. Okay, but for some guys, I mean, probably the biggest thing that kept guys from going federal during those days, specifically with like DEA and FBI, was you don't know where you're going to end up. And so...
Yeah, no guarantee you're coming back to Texas.
No. Well, a guarantee that you wouldn't come back to Texas back in those days. I think it's different now. That was a downside for guys. I didn't see that as a downside because I was trying to look at the big picture, the long game. Right. The long game wasn't, gee, I want to live in this one spot. If I wanted to do that, let's say my goal was to always live in Scottsdale, Arizona, which... Now in wintertime in Kansas City, that seems to be my goal.
Sounds pretty nice, actually,
on a daily basis. But if my goal was to get to a specific city, I would just go apply for the police department, and then I'm there.
That's fair,
and I can stay there. I didn't really care so much about that. I mean, I didn't want to end up on the border for the next 30 years, but I understood that was a risk, but there were opportunities to move around, which is the main thing. I think a lot of guys don't see that. I think a lot of guys, frankly, might be a little short-sighted with that, and they get sort of too wrapped up in where am I going to be sent for my first assignment.
Was there like a specific expectation, like, boy, there's a good chance I'm going to end up in El Paso or Brownsville or San Diego or something like that?
Yeah, there was a chance. It's funny, at the time, the thing that scared me the most, and again, it's because I didn't know anything about it, was I was going to be sent to Detroit. Now that sounds like you're thinking, why Detroit? Number one, because coming from Dallas, Detroit sounded like going to the North Pole. But in retrospect, I ended up marrying a woman from Detroit, and I've spent a ton of time in Michigan. So Detroit would have been just fine. But my point is that I think there are guys that everyone sort of has, when you would go to the academy, at least back in those days, they had a certain idea like, okay, I can do this, but I really don't want to go to Laredo, or I really don't want to go to Miami, or I really don't want to go to whatever the city is. I mean, you roll the dice, and I ended up in Alabama. So
really, okay,
yeah, of all places.
So let me ask: you were married when you went to Quantico?
I was.
Okay, so where did the wife go? Did she stay in Texas? Did she move somewhere?
No, so she stayed in Dallas while I was at the academy, and then we got our assignment, and then we moved down to our assignment, our first assignment.
Okay, and how long were you expecting to stay? And your first assignment was Alabama, so how long did you expect to stay there? Were you buying a home? Were you just getting an apartment?
Well, so good question. DEA didn't have a strict like, okay, we're going to do 5 years here and 7 years here. It was more, all right, you're going to get to your first office, and we're going to expect you to do 3 to 5 years there, and then you can start putting in for things.
Okay. So a little vague at first. Yeah,
a little vague. So I could have probably stayed there for a long time. And, but again, sort of goes back to, that's not why I signed up. I didn't sign up to go to one place for my career. And that was just me. Other guys sort of have different ways of looking at that, and they're all legitimate. That was just that's the way I looked at it.
While we're still talking about negatives, let me have you fast forward to the end of your career. What's the cost of being a DEA agent? Is there something that people just don't anticipate, that it's like, man, that bites you in the butt every time?
It sort of becomes all about you and your career, which, I was raised by my father to believe that, you're a man and you go pursue a career, and that's what you do. And that's number one.
You have a sense of duty.
And you provide for your family in a sense of duty. Yeah. And I still believe that. And I was all for that. In terms of the downside is, DEA, they demand a lot. Not the culture demands a lot, right? If you join DEA, you're all in. You don't join DEA just because you're looking for just some job in federal law enforcement. You join DEA because you want to be at the tip of the spear for sort of rule of law, justice issues in the U.S. Drug trafficking is a huge international issue. So you sort of have to be devoted to that, and you have to be devoted to that career and developing that career. That's the way I looked at it. So that's a downside. So there were plenty of late nights, early mornings, overnights. It takes a lot out of your life, but I wouldn't have had it any other way, because that's the way I was wired. That's what I wanted to do.
You wanted to be in.
Yeah, I wanted to do that. So that appealed to me. I had no problem with that. Some guys over time, that does affect their families, I think. But again, to me, and this is probably not the purpose of this podcast, but the sort of the chicken or the egg thing, right? Are people in law enforcement like sort of molded because they were in law enforcement, or that's the way they were to begin with, and they chose law enforcement because that aligned with who they were? I tend to believe that it sort of more aligns with who you are anyway. Yeah. And that's why you choose law enforcement versus you just sort of blindly go into law enforcement, and then all of a sudden it transforms you into some other person.
How many times did you move? Do you even know, as a DEA agent? How
yeah,
many times did they pack you up, and like actually your family, not just a trip where you took, but like your family had to pack up and move?
I think I had 4 moves, so I really didn't have that many moves. Okay. And one of the reasons why so I know a lot of guys that have had many more moves than that, but I also know guys who have had far fewer moves than that with DEA.
That's 4 moves in 23
years.
23 years? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's not bad, really.
Yeah. I would have been okay with more moves, frankly. That's just me. But I ended up staying in my first office for quite a while longer, because a little while after we got there, I went through a divorce, and my ex-wife stayed there, and so I had a son there. And so I wanted to stay there while he was young. So I ended up staying there professionally longer than I wanted to, because there were some other things, some other opportunities that I turned down.
Talk to me about that, because that is legitimately difficult.
Yeah.
You now, if you get moved, your family, because of the divorce, is not necessarily going with you.
Right.
What would you say to somebody now? Maybe they've just gone through a divorce and they've got to make a decision that could lead to a move. How do you weigh out that? That's a serious dilemma. How do you weigh that out? How do you know, is it okay if I move away or is it not okay? How did you work that out?
It was a horribly difficult, painful, giant decision. And that was, many, many, many years ago for me. And it's still hard to wrestle with.
Because there's no perfect answer there, is there?
There's no perfect answer because you have to, your kids need to do well, right? And you want to be there for your kids. You also want to thrive professionally too, to some extent. You want to set an example, I think, for your kids about this is what life can look like, and then this is what sort of pursuing your dreams can look like. I turned down a number of opportunities, and I finally had an opportunity that came up, and my son was old enough that I thought I could thread that needle, that I could balance it. And I ended up balancing it. And it was fine. It was very tough at the time. You beat yourself up over some of the decisions. In retrospect, it was a fantastic decision, and it opened up my son's world to a lot of stuff that he wouldn't have known. So yeah, I mean, obviously each person's situation is completely different.
What did you worry about that you shouldn't have?
I think I worried about maybe the connection with him. How is that going to change? And that had zero effect on our love for each other. You also worry a little bit about what are others in your orbit going to say about what you're doing or their opinion. Because, everyone has an opinion.
Yeah.
And so you have to figure out, how much of that do you need to weigh and how much of it is noise. And so that was difficult. I struggled for a little while with that. Any
other advice to someone going through that right now? Let's say they are a federal agent. They have the opportunity to move. Any other guidance for them?
I think if you can work the logistics and are willing to spend the money to do it, because it's expensive. The travel can be expensive. It worked out well for me, and I was able to put a good plan together. And I had a very supportive spouse that I was remarried, and that part of it worked out well.
The logistics being specifically
travel,
like traveling to see the kid, or having your child fly to you.
Both, yeah, exactly, yeah. So that was a challenge. There is something to be said for resilience, and there is something to be said for new experiences and overcoming challenges, and that's not all necessarily a bad thing. In my case, I can see ways in which my son benefited from that. He's an adult now, but I can see how that benefited him specifically. So I think the main thing is you don't beat yourself up over it. A lot of people go through this. You have to sort of do the best you can. There's no perfect decision. And you're going to continue to love your child no matter which way you turn. Yeah. And they're going to be fine. The issue is really you. Yeah. And at the time, I didn't really understand that. I was completely focused on, on him and how this was going to affect him. He was just fine. The issue was more me, and me probably worrying too much about some other voices. So
sure. Yeah, I can see as you're talking to me, I can see that this matters to you deeply.
Oh, it was. I mean,
this is how many years ago? 20 years ago or something? And
20 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and I can see it in your face how much this meant to you then, and how much it still means to you.
Yeah. I don't want to get in a time machine. I'm happy where I am right now.
Yeah.
As it relates to that. So,
thank you so much. You did a great job. I appreciate you coming in.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
I want to thank Todd for being on the show, and I also want to thank the person who recommended him. Todd was recommended by Major Joe Gracella. You know Joe. He's the commander that does my year-end evaluations each December. Thank you, Joe. Todd was everything you promised he'd be. If you have a recommendation for someone on the show, and especially if you have a connection, please contact me. My email is in the show notes. In part 2 of this episode of Hey Chaplain. what drugs are coming through Canada?
So Canada had, when I was up there, fentanyl was just starting to become a little bit of an issue. Methamphetamine was an issue up there. Cocaine was an issue. I would say methamphetamine and cocaine were two of the very big issues when I was there. Canada deals with some unique organized crime issues up there because their laws are very different from U.S. laws. So they don't have the equivalent to sort of our RICO type laws, where if you arrest someone and they're looking at 1 million years, they have the ability to cooperate and tell you about everyone else in the organization. That doesn't exist up there. They're working a biker case and they put some, because, bikers in prison up there, no one's going to have to rat on anyone else. So they'll come out of prison with the same amount of credibility that they went into prison, so they can continue their activities.
Right. And the lower level guys can get arrested, and that doesn't necessarily jeopardize the people above them in the organization.
Right, because there's no mechanism within the law to grant favor to someone based on their cooperation. Very different from the U.S.
Yeah. Just recently, someone followed the link that says text the show in the episode description and left me an interesting text. They said, "Greetings from Massachusetts. I saw your post about funding a table at the July conference in Arkansas and was wondering what your registration fundraising deadline is. Perhaps I missed that in the description. First of all, thank you for writing. And I am going to be at the International Conference of Police Chaplains annual training seminar in Little Rock, Arkansas this summer in July. But in order to set up a Hey Chaplain booth at the conference, I need to have that in by the end of May 31st. So if you want to help Hey Chaplain set up a table at the ICPC, just follow the link that says support the show in the show notes of this episode." The views expressed here are the personal views of the hosts and our guests and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, pray for peace in our city.